One of the greatest gifts that I've ever gotten in my life was in 2016, Christmas morning, and I'm 13 years old. And I come running down the stairs with my two younger brothers, and I look underneath the Christmas tree. It's this artificial tree. It's not even wrapped. And in front of me is the Nintendo Wii. And I was shocked. Like, usually my parents would have been like, oh, let's see what Santa brought you. But not this year. They're like, look at what we got you. Like, my mom stood in line for hours. They were sold out everywhere. We totally didn't expect it. Me, my younger brothers, we were so excited. We ripped it up. We plugged in and we started playing Wii Sports, Wii Bowling, Wii Boxing, all of the Wii stuff. And we were having so much fun as a family. But pretty soon there was a problem. Because we had all gotten different games. And I was a little bit older, so the game that I got is like a single-player game. And my younger brothers got these games that everybody could play, but they were kind of like little kid games, and we all had to take turns. But I didn't really want to take turns playing their game, and they always wanted me to play, so I came up with a plan. And so I went to my younger brothers and I said, listen, guys, here's the deal. If you let me play a little bit longer, then when it's your turn, I'll play with you. And they were like, they weren't foolish. They were pretty skeptical. They're like, all right, Will, do you promise? I said, yeah, of course. So I got to play my game, and it was awesome. Played a little longer. Then I was done. They come running up to me for me to play with them. But I really didn't want to play anymore. I was kind of tired of it. And I was like, hey, guys, listen, I'm not going to play with you. I don't really want to. And I'll never forget, the look of devastation on my younger brother's face when he looked at me. And he said, but Will, you promised. You promised. Promises are really important. And promises have been really important for a long time. In fact, entire cultures and societies were based upon promises. And today, in America, it's a little different, and I think sometimes we can believe that a promise only counts when you say the magic words, I promise. So if you don't say the magic words, I promise, then it doesn't really count. But we know that's not really true, and back in the day, they had it a little bit more accurate, that your word was your character. You had honor. It was who you were as a person, that you meant what you said, and what you said was what you were going to do, and you were going to be who you needed to be. And I think we kind of get that idea, even though it's a little bit different today in 2024 here in America. For example, I've never had to go to my 1-year-old daughter, Cora, and I've never said, Cora, I promise that I'm going to feed you today. I've never said it. I've never said that, Cora, I promise that I'm going to take care of you. I never said, Cora, I promise that I'm not going to neglect you, that I'm not going to abuse you. I never said, Cora, I promise that I'm going to love you. Because I didn't have to. Because I'm her dad. Because promises are bigger than just when we say the magic words, I promise. Promises are our role in our life and our relationships with other people. They're bigger than just the magic words. I'm her dad, and so I have promised her to do things just because I'm her dad. Now, we all know what it feels like when someone breaks a promise, don't we? It really hurts. We know what that feels like. And even though I bet you've probably never gone to your friends and said, hey, will you promise me that you're not going to gossip about me or talk about me behind my back? When they do, it hurts. And it feels like you've been betrayed. And maybe you're here today and maybe you've had people that have broken promises to you. Maybe you've had moms or dads that didn't do what moms and dads are supposed to do. Maybe you've had girlfriends or boyfriends or spouses that didn't keep their promises. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. Maybe you've had people in the church who didn't do what they were supposed to do, and they broke promises to you. That's one of the most painful things I think that we can experience in our lives is a broken promise. And yet, if we can all be honest with each other for a minute, we all break promises. Like all the time. I break promises all the time. I'm not the husband that I should be. I'm not the dad that I should be. I don't always do everything that I say I'm going to do, even though I know I'm hurting other people. Why do we do that? We all know what it feels like to be affected by a broken promise, and yet we break promises all the time. What do we do? Today, as we look at the life of David, we're going to see that God is going to show us that we need to know God's promise to keep your promise. That we need to know God's promises to keep our promises. Because God's promises are a lot like our promises. Sometimes in the Bible, God says the magic words. He says, I promise. I'm going to do this. But other times, God's promise is just who he is. And it's just his relationship to us. And we need to know God's promises in order to keep our promises. So we're going to look at the life of David after he's become a king, and we're going to see 2 points in his life. One where he forgot God's promise and a man died. And another where he remembered God's promise and a man's life was changed forever. So before we jump into our passage, we got to catch up of where we are in this life story of David. So King Saul and his sons have all died. They were killed in a battle against the enemy Philistines. They died in a battle, and because the king died, there was a tons of infighting and people trying to become the next king and fighting for the throne. Eventually, David comes out on top. He officially is made king. He's successful in his military endeavors, and he brings peace and rest to the land. And here, as we look at our passage, David has decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. And this was a really big deal because the Ark of the Covenant was like the dwelling place of God. Think about it like God's throne. Like God's presence was in the Ark. It wasn't trapped in the Ark, but he was like sitting upon it like a king would sit upon a throne. And the Ark of the Covenant coming back to Jerusalem is this really important symbol that God is going to finally be dwelling with his people again. And so it's this big celebration. David and 30,000 men go and get the Ark to bring it back to Jerusalem. There's all of this celebration and music and singing. And then something awful happens. We're in 2 Samuel Chapter 6, verse 6, says, a man named Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down and he died there beside the ark of God. So, in this big parade, celebrations are happening. The Ark of the Covenant is on the back of a wagon. It looks a little like this. It's on the back of a wagon being drawn by oxen, and people are dancing and celebrating, and the oxen stumble, and a man close to it named Uzzah reaches out to try to stop the ark from falling onto the ground. And God kills him because he touches the ark. If you're like me, when I hear that, the first time I read that, I was a little appalled. I said, God, that seems like a pretty harsh thing to do. It seemed like Uzzah was trying to do a good thing. He's trying to keep the throne of God, creator of the universe, from falling in the dirt. It seems like that's a really good thing. Why would God punish him? It seems like God's being a bully here. This is where it's really important to understand the bigger picture of what's happening. We have to understand context and zoom out just a little bit. Because the Ark of the Covenant was never supposed to be on the back of a wagon like a piece of luggage. In fact, God had given very clear instructions on how they were supposed to move and transport the ark. In Numbers chapter 7, Moses is giving different responsibilities. This is before David's time. He's giving different responsibilities to different people groups, and he says this, but Moses did not give any responsibilities to the Kohathites because they were to carry on their shoulders the holy things, which means the ark, for which they were responsible. They were supposed to carry the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, not throw it in the back of a wagon like a piece of luggage, like a burden. This is the throne of God. And it sounds a little weird to us now, but back then, that's how kings got around. They didn't have limos. They didn't have Air Force One. Like, that's how kings got around. In fact, here's a picture of King Ramses around the same time, and you can see that on his throne, it would be carried by all these different people. And that's how the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be carried and transported, with these very specific priests carried on their shoulders, symbolizing this throne of God. But it wasn't. It was thrown on the back of a wagon to be pulled by a bunch of animals. That's not the only clear instruction that God gives us about the ark. Also in Numbers, he says, "But they must not touch the holy things, the ark, or they will die." The Kohathites are to carry those things that are in the tent of meeting. God says if they touch it, they will die. He promises that if anyone touches the ark, they're going to die. Now, David would have had access to Numbers, to this scripture. It was before his time. He would have been able to read it. He would have been taught it. He would have known it. And he would have immediately found out three things pretty quickly. Number one, the ark needs to be carried. Two, there's a very specific group of people that are to do it. And if anyone touches it, they're going to die. The first thing that David should have done when he wanted to go get the ark and bring it back to Jerusalem is open up the scroll and read what God said about moving this throne. But he didn't. We don't know exactly why he didn't. But there's a couple options that I think make sense. The first is maybe he just looked to see what everybody else was doing. Because the only other time that the ark is put on a wagon like this is when the enemy, Philistines, give the ark back to the Israelite people. The enemy's treated like a piece of luggage, like a burden, and they say, get rid of it. And maybe David saw, that looks like a good idea. That's how they're doing it. So instead of looking to see what God's instructions were, he looked around to see what everybody else was doing. Can we relate to that? Maybe he's like, it seems like this is a better idea, doesn't it? Like, carrying it on your shoulder, that seems like a lot of work. This was probably easier. It was probably quicker. So maybe David used his own cunning, his own wisdom. Maybe he relied on himself instead of looking to see what God had to say about it, and decided to put it on the back of a wagon. And maybe he was just too busy to check. Maybe he didn't care. David was just made king. He had a lot of important stuff going on. Maybe he's like, I'm just a little too busy to check, and we're just going to wing it. David was responsible for the death of Uzzah as the leader appointed by God to his people. Now, I think when we read the story, we can get kind of like uncomfortable with this. It's a little like, feels a little wrong. Because it feels like Uzzah had good intentions, doesn't it? Why would Uzzah be punished for good intentions? Even if David made a mistake, why is Uzzah being punished for good intentions? And friends, this is like a big truth that can be a little hard for us to swallow. But this is really important. Good intentions don't overpower God's promises. Good intentions don't overpower God's promises. Uzzah might have had good intentions, but God had to, he must, and he will keep his promises. But that's actually a good thing. Like, that's actually a good thing. And you know why? Because people are really bad judges of what's good. Like, we always think that what we're doing is good. We justify it, we defend it, like we always think that what we're doing is good. For example, if you're driving and someone cuts you off, you think, wow, what a jerk. But what happens when you cut somebody off? You're like, well, I'm late, I slept in, my baby's crying, I gotta get to this meeting. We justify it, we defend ourselves. Or maybe you've gone to take a test before and you're like, I'm gonna cheat a little bit because this teacher's no good, I had too much homework, I didn't study, my future's really important, I gotta do well on this test. We justify ourselves. People steal from Walmart, from Marshalls all the time because they think, well, this is a big corporation, I deserve this. We justify whatever we want to do. In fact, some of the most horrific things that have ever happened in human history were done by people who thought they were doing a good thing. Hitler thought that what he was doing was good for humanity. And it's one of the greatest atrocities that's ever happened in our modern age. We are very bad judges of what is good. But we don't have to guess. We don't have to stumble around in the dark. We don't have to wonder, because what God says is always good. His promises are always good. We don't have to guess. We don't have to stumble. We don't have to look what other people are doing. His promises are always good, and they trump our good intentions. I think the takeaway for us is this, in this story of Uzzah that makes us a little uncomfortable. We need to know God's promises. We need to know who God is and what his promises are. Because good intentions and ignorance aren't excuses. We get that. Like, you can't go in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, I didn't know that was illegal. That's not going to go well for you. And it's the same way with God's promises. Ignorance is not an excuse. And good intentions don't overpower God's promises. We need to know God's promises. David forgot, or he didn't care, or he was too busy. And he got a man killed because of it. So that's the time that David forgot God's promise. Now I want to look at a time where he remembered God's promise. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 9. King David asked, Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? His servant Ziba answered the king, There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. This son of Jonathan is the most dangerous man in the entire kingdom of Israel. He's the most dangerous man. Why would David want to show him God's kindness? Because if there's anybody in the entire kingdom that can bring down David's kingship, it's this guy. If there's anybody that can steal the throne from David, it's the son of Jonathan. Because the son of Jonathan was the grandson of King Saul. And if you were alive back then, any political advisor would have told you that if you became king, you needed to kill everybody in the family of the old king. Because if you kept anybody in the family of the old king alive, that was a threat for you. Because they would build rebellions, they'd build armies to attack you and to steal your throne. It was an unimaginable threat. It would have been not a question. This is what happened all the time. But if you remember, back when David was on the run from King Saul, he was friends with Saul's son named Jonathan. And he makes a promise to Jonathan. And he says, Jonathan, when I become king, I'm not going to do what every political advisor tells me to do. I'm not going to kill you, and I'm not going to kill your whole family because I love you. And unfortunately, Saul's son, Jonathan, and all of his other sons were killed in battle. But now that David is king, he wants to keep his promise and not go after the son of Jonathan. But not only that, and this is what's so important, he doesn't want to just not kill him. He wants to show him God's kindness. Don't miss this. He wants to show him God's kindness. What does that mean? Well, he brings this guy to him and he says, Don't be afraid. David said to him, For I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. Jonathan, I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. This man's name is Mephibosheth, and he bowed down and said, What is your servant? He can't believe he's still alive. What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's own sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. God's kindness that David wants to show his enemy, the greatest threat in the kingdom, is not only to keep his promise, but he wants to show him the same kindness that God has given to David. And God's kindness means that he's going to give them a land, he's going to give them a home, he's going to give them a place at his table in his family. And because of this amazing kindness, this guy's entire family legacy was changed. This cripple had a son. He had no hope of having a son. He was lame in both feet. He couldn't even walk. David had nothing to get out of this deal. But he shows God's kindness. And the kindness of God is the kind of kindness that loves your enemies. God's kindness is the kind of love that loves people who have nothing to give you. God's kindness is the kind of love that loves people who are disabled, outcasts, and without hope. As we look at David's life, we see glimpses of who God is. And we know that David's great-great-great-great-great-grandson is going to be Jesus. In David, we see shadows of who God is, but in the person of Jesus, we get the whole picture, every promise about who God is, about what he says, and about what his relationship is to us is fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus completes this perfectly because Jesus is going to show us that God's kindness and loving your enemies is not just giving a place at the table, it's giving a place in God's house forever. He's going to show us that loving your enemy isn't just not killing them when you could, but dying for them when they don't deserve it. Jesus is going to show us the full picture of who God is in all of his promises. But don't miss this, that David was able to love this enemy because he knew God's kindness. He had experienced God's kindness, and then he could in turn give that to other people. We've got to know God's promises so that we can keep our promises. We've got to know who God is so that we can be who we are, who we're supposed to be. Maybe you're here and the first step for you in knowing God's promises is to trust in Jesus. Because here's the truth. You cannot have a relationship with God, you cannot know God, and you cannot have peace with God without Jesus. He is the full picture of who God is. And the first step to that is turning away from the old way of life and living and choosing to live a Jesus way of life. And it's better. The Jesus way of life is better. There's so many lies. There's so many broken hearts and broken promises in this broken world, but the Jesus way of life is better. And when you believe in the Jesus and his way of living, then you get all of the promises of God that he makes to people who love him. Maybe you're here today and you have a relationship with Jesus, but you're not quite so sure what God's promises are. We need to know God's promises before we can experience them and give them to other people. The best way to know God's promises is to read the Bible. That's the best way, even if it's a verse a day, every once in a while. The best place to know God's promises is by opening up the Bible and reading it. If you are here and you have just been hurt by broken promises, by people who hurt you, by not being who they're supposed to be, put your faith and your trust not in people, but in God. Because his promises, he always keeps. God will never break your heart. He will never let you down. He always does what he says he's going to do. That doesn't mean that you don't trust people, but it means that you don't put your hope in people, and you put your hope in God. You can count on him. There's so many lies in this world, but you can build your life on God and his promises. You know, maybe you're here today and you've trusted in Jesus and you know who God is, you know the promises. Maybe for you, you need to take the next step. Because God doesn't give us kindness so we can just keep it for ourselves. He gives it so we can give it away to other people. It's not good enough just to know that God loves you. You've got to go and give out that love to other people. It's not enough just to know that you are forgiven if you don't forgive other people. It's not enough to know that God is patient and merciful to you if you're not patient and merciful to other people. We've got to turn around and give it to other people like David did. We experience God's promises and we turn and we keep our own. Now, the way to do that isn't by trying really hard to be a good person. That doesn't do it because we're not. It's so important that the kindness and the love that we show other people, it has to come from outside of ourselves. It comes from God. So the way that you become more like Him, the way that you're able to keep your promises and be who you're supposed to be, is by praying and meditating and thinking about how God loves you, about how He's kind to you, about how He's been merciful and forgiving to you, and the overflow of that is going to spill onto other people. So spend time enjoying Him, enjoying His promises. You know, as you leave today, there's going to be a sheet of paper by the door that you can pick up, and there's 77 promises that God makes to people who love Him. And that can be a good starting point for some of us. Read one. Read one a day and think about it. Think about how it impacts you in your life and how that can turn around and impact other people. I mean, can you imagine if you were just a little bit more like God to the people around you? Can you imagine if you kept your promises like God keeps His promises? Imagine if your friends never had to worry about you gossiping about them or about talking behind their back. Imagine if your kids could count on you to show up and be who you're supposed to be. Imagine at your funeral that your friends and your family didn't say, wow, yeah, they were such a nice person. They paid their bills on time. They worked hard. But imagine if they said, because of your love, they understood God's love better. Imagine if they said, because of your kindness, they understood God's kindness better. Think about how you could change your family legacy. Think about how you could continue to grow your family legacy. You know, Fireside Church, let's be a people who build our church on the promises that God makes us, because we know He will always keep them, so that we can be a people who keep our promises and be who we're supposed to be.